Great, thank you very much indeed. Let me just start by thanking Dave and the committee for actually organising a kind of a series of events around D-Day. There's a very nice exhibition in the village hall, in the church rather, which Sam Tillotson has put together, I believe. And I do think it's important, not exactly to celebrate, but to remember D-Day.
You look like a shadow.
Oh, okay. I do think it's important to remember D-Day. One of the most sort of persistent feelings I got when I was preparing this talk was how lucky I was not to have fought, not to have come from a generation which has had to fight these wars. I mean, when you go into the details, you realise war is unbelievably horrible. And I think we're all probably in the same boat, that we're super lucky not to have, just by chance in a way, not to have been born into the generation of, my father and our fathers, grandfathers and their fathers, which have had to fight wars. So I thought I would start, before I sort of get into the story, I thought I would start by way of sort of trying to remember these brave people, to just highlight two local people that I've learnt about just literally in the last couple of days that were involved in the D-Day landings. So the first is Frank Broom, who's Marie Woodidge's grandfather, and Marie is in the audience. Frank's is buried just behind the church in the graveyard there. You can see his gravestone just behind the church. He was in the parachute regiment, and they went in on the very, very early hours of the 6th of June, before any of the troops had landed on the beaches, to storm and capture what's called Pegasus Bridge, which is one of the bridges leading to the so-called Sword Beach, which is one of the British beaches. And that was critical because the Germans could have, sent troops across the bridge to attack and to reinforce the defences and attack the British on the beaches. So they took that bridge before the British arrived at the very hours of June the 6th. So there's Frank having a drink. And the other person I learnt about was Norton Lee, Nicola Walter's father. And again, another just fantastically remarkable story. He commanded one of the many landing vehicles which landed the troops. And this was actually on the Omaha beach, which is one of the American beaches. But he was sort of seconded to the Americans to help land on that beach. And as I will describe, the weather was a really critical factor in this whole story. And as they were approaching the beach, the landing craft started to get swamped by water from these high waves, and they had to evacuate and move to a different landing craft, and so on, all the while being bombarded with shells and bullets and stuff from the Germans. So two absolutely remarkable people, but as I say, let's just spend a few seconds just thinking about them as sort of examples of the heroes that basically allowed us to live our lives without having to go through these terrible times. So just take a second and we'll think about that. Yeah. So this is all part of Operation Overlord, which was the greatest air and seaborne landings the world had seen. 115,000 soldiers on the beaches, paratroopers, and one thing I didn't show here, by the way, was you can actually just see in the top corner here this was taken very shortly after D-Day, and there are a couple of gliders which had landed, which had they were actually one of the ones that landed pretty much where they should have landed. A lot of them landed far away because of the weather, but the gliders and the paratroopers played an important role in taking the bridge there. Anyway, so yeah, Operation Overlord, fantastically important, and the largest invasion fleet the world has seen. Many of the paratroopers and gliders took off in airfields around here: RAF, Welford, Harwell, Greenham Common, Hampstead Norris, Membury. Maybe there are others, I don't know. So you might ask the question, how could it possibly fail? What could go wrong? And the answer is the weather. And a lot of this talk will be about the weather, kind of because that's what I do. But it's a kind of I hope it's an interesting story. So there were various requirements for D-Day, and the most important ones was low tide and a clear sky with ideally with moonlight. Low tide because obviously the Germans had put loads of mines and obstacles under the sea that would have overturned or blown up the landing craft. And low tide, especially special low tide, was needed to expose these to the open. And some of the very early soldiers that went in, their job was to destroy these anti-landing obstacles as best they could. Now that really restricted low tide and full moon, really restricted the possibilities. And the three dates, pretty much in the summer of '44, were June 5th, 6th, and 7th, or June 19, 20, and 21. Eisenhower was very keen to go as early as possible for the simple reason he did not want the invasion plans to be discovered. As I'm sure everyone knows, they were doing their best. The Allies were doing their best to try to trick Hitler into thinking they were going to invade in Calais, whereas they had chosen the Normandy beaches. And there's all sorts of possible ways that deception could have been found out. So he wanted to go as early as he could. So his ideal date was June the 5th. But the weather was the critical factor, and there were various criteria. So the winds in particular should not exceed, they thought, about force 3. Otherwise, stuff which actually did happen at Omaha, that landing craft would start to broach and swamp, drowning crew. So many American soldiers were drowned just by the fact that they could not even reach the beach when their landing craft submerged. So that was a key criteria. Also, strong winds made it impossible for gliders to land, and paratroopers would be dispersed, and that did happen to some extent on the 6th, as we'll see. And the other factor for the weather was cloud, which would prevent the bombers from destroying their targets, which was mainly the German defences along the coast there. So the weather was known to be a factor in this, and this is an interesting letter or note which Eisenhower penned and was found, or I don't know, was put in his wallet and was subsequently found, which was a note he had written in case the D-Day landings had failed. He wrote that our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. So he was far from convinced that D-Day would be a success.
Mr. Trump had played it.
My story is going to be about a place, sort of one of the most isolated places in Ireland you can imagine, right on the tip of County Mayo, called Blacksod Bay. Blacksod being named after all the peat and stuff that's in the area. And a lady called Maureen Flavin, which basically saved Eisenhower from actually not writing but publishing that note. He never had to take it back out of his wallet. And I'm going to discuss, without her reports, weather reports, the history of the second half, and indeed to the present day, would have been radically different. Maureen was recognized by the US House of Congress when she was in her 90s, and she went over to America to receive a congressional medal for her work. Although, to be honest, she was she wasn't aware really of what she was doing at the time, but nevertheless she played a critical role. That little white box so this is a picture of the post office in Blacksod Bay, and I'll say a bit more about that. The white box is what's called a Stevenson screen, and it has weather measurements that inside it, temperatures and pressure and so on. Stevenson was a Scottish engineer whose son, by the way, was Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island and that sort of thing. But anyway, he invented a kind of a way of insulating meteorological instruments so they weren't affected by sunlight and so on. And I'm going to argue that if that box hadn't been there, this was taken during the war, if that box hadn't been there, probably we wouldn't be standing here today. So this is going to be an example of the butterfly effect. So it's a reason why I find history sometimes fascinating. I mean, we've probably heard of the butterfly effect in terms of weather. If the butterfly flaps its wings, it can make the difference between a tornado forming in Texas or not a week later. But butterflies flapping their wings can also change the course of history. And this talk will be about an example of butterfly effect. My favourite, I don't know if this is a diversion, probably is a bit, but my favourite example, I can't help but tell this because it's such a great story. My favourite example of the butterfly effect in history concerns Queen Victoria's first daughter, whose name was also Victoria, or Vicky as they called her. And being kind of descended from the Hanoverians and so on, they had very close ties, probably still do, don't they, to the royalty, to the German aristocracy. And Vicky went over to Germany and married a German prince called Fritz. And in the course of time they had a child who was called William or Wilhelm. And he was delivered by a team of doctors led by Vicky's personal physician, whose name was Sir Alan Clark. That's right, I remembered that. Sir Alan Clark. So he was the head of the team that delivered the baby. Problem with the baby was it was born in the breech position, so it came out like backside first rather than head first. And Sir Alan and his crew made a real mess of the delivery. They basically tore what's called, I think, the brachia plexus, so it's one part of the arm on trying to get the baby out, which basically created, for the rest of his life, William had this kind of withered and paralysed arm. This is actually his left arm, so couldn't do anything with it. Vicky herself was in so much pain and agony that they kind of kept, pummeling her with chloroform and other, terrible, Victorian anaesthetics, which had the effect of causing, brain, oxygen depletion to the baby's brain at this kind of crucial time. So all the modern historians think that caused a lot of the behavioural problems that the baby had. Hyperactivity, very short attention span, poor sort of social skills and so on. Now, when Fritz and Vicky came over to England for the summer season, they'd come over for Ascot and Henley and all the stuff that people do. William was kept very much away from the public gaze. He was kept, in a sort of at home and never allowed out. He was kind of considered a cripple, basically, and he grew up as a young man with a visceral hatred of all things English as a result of this. As a result of being shunned by society, he grew up with a visceral hatred. Now, this is an unfortunate story, except for the fact that Fritz subsequently became the Kaiser of Germany, so he was called Kaiser Frederick. But he didn't last very long because he had terminal cancer, and within 100 days, William, or Wilhelm, became Kaiser himself, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And with his visceral hatred of Britain, he now built up the German armaments, and the navy in particular, to match the British. That was his kind of mission in life, to match the British, what was then, obviously we were the preeminent power in the world, to match us. And having done that, he was itching for a fight. And when some student activist shot an aging Archduke in Sarajevo of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he immediately got on, I don't know if they had the phone in those days, but he would have immediately got on to the Austro-Hungarians and told them to henceforth invade Serbia, because it's the only decent thing to do, knowing that Serbia had an alliance with Russia and France had an alliance with Russia, and that it would bring those powers in, and that then he could attack France, and if he went through Belgium it would bring the British in, and all his dreams would be fulfilled. And of course, the First World War happened, and the Versailles Treaty put Germany into mass economic deprivation and hyperinflation in the 20s, which led to the rise of Hitler, and the Second World War, which is the story I want to tell. So the butterfly effect is, if Sir Alan Clark had only spent a little bit more time delivering that baby, we wouldn't have had either the First or the Second World Wars. So this is the classic example of the butterfly. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little bit carried away. So, and this is in the same genre as I'll try to describe. I do want to kind of give a little bit of background. I myself appeared in a TV documentary series probably about 10 years ago on BBC. I can't remember if it was BBC 2 or BBC 4, but one of those channels. Certainly wasn't BBC 1. Called Stormtroopers. It's based about the history of weather forecasting from sort of old times up to the present. And Maureen Flavin, who, by the way, I didn't say that, she lived till age 100, and she only died at the end of last year. But she was in her 90s when this documentary was made, and I didn't meet her in person, but we appeared, if you like, on the same TV series. So that was where I first became aware of her story. And then there's a book written by a guy called John Ross, who's a Canadian, I believe, going through the detail about the weather forecast for D-Day. So I got a lot of sort of details from that book as well. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge my sources. So I just want to quickly say, I'm going to talk about D-Day, but weather was obviously a pretty important feature of the war, and we always had, the RAF just routinely would have weather reconnaissance flights going around the Atlantic, trying to take meteorological measurements, seeing where the clouds and were, and the weather systems and so on. But a lot of what we now sort of take for granted in weather forecasting, or indeed the weather, was only beginning to be understood during the war. And one example of that are what we now call jet streams. I think we're all kind of, those of us who've flown, for example, from London to New York, we know that it takes quite a long time to go in one direction, but it can take almost no time to go in the other direction if you catch the jet stream. That's the big thing. And the jet stream is this river of fast-moving air, up 10 kilometres or more above the surface of the Earth. But in the time of World War II, they were only just beginning to understand that there were these rather, localised rivers of air with very high velocity, and sometimes it was to the detriment of aircrew. So there's a very classic example of a bombing mission to Berlin a few months before D-Day, where the weather forecasters had forecast winds of around 40 knots at their altitude they were flying, and it turned out to be 140 knots. And so as they tried to get back to, having dropped the bombs and tried to get back to Britain, they realised that they were basically sitting ducks for the people firing guns at them, and a lot of the crew and planes were lost and so that was a kind of tragedy from not understanding enough about the weather systems in the atmosphere. On a more positive note, some of the real successes which led to the complete solving the Enigma code at Bletchley Park, the German Enigma code, actually came from decoding weather reports. So we knew how weather reports were encoded by Germans. And we had our own, weather network. So there were situations where we knew what the temperature was and the pressure and stuff like that, and we knew how that was encoded by the Germans in the when it was sent back to Berlin or wherever. So that was a real kind of important clue as to how to break the Enigma coding, because the weather reports were then coded with the Enigma machines. And I mean, one of the sort of slightly amusing things about this is that, of course, the Germans never knew that we had decoded Enigma, and not only were we able to use the, as I say, use the weather to decode Enigma. Having done it, we could then take advantage of all the weather reports that the Germans would send all over Europe, back to Berlin, to give us precise pictures of what the weather was like. So that worked out pretty well. And then D-Day, which we'll talk about. Okay, good. Right. Here's a map from Google Maps or something. If you go about an hour or so south of Peasmore, missing the road closed because of the waterworks, by the way, taking a detour around Mud Lane, but go on for an hour down the A34 and then sort of cut across country a little bit. You get to a place called Southwick House, which is just north of Portsmouth. It's up on the Downs, and today it's actually it's the sort of, I think it's the headquarters of where the military police have all their training stuff. But Southwick House, which was a stately home, I suppose, at some stage, and there's a picture of it with me. Jill and I went there a couple of months ago to visit. You can't just turn up, you have to actually say, I'd like to come and visit. I'll explain why you might want to go and visit in a minute. But anyway, that was the headquarters of what was called the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. So that was basically where Eisenhower was based in the days leading up to D-Day. That was the kind of central focal point for D-Day, just outside Portsmouth in this old country house. There's a picture of Eisenhower, I guess somewhere like here, somewhere, during the war. On his right, so it's our left, is Ramsey, Admiral Ramsey, who was the head of the Navy. We'll come to him again shortly. I don't know if this is a bit of scurrilous detail, but I asked the lady who showed us around where Eisenhower's bedroom was, and she said, "Oh well, he actually never stayed in the house. He had a caravan which was parked sort of somewhere at the edge of the grounds, some distance away." Turns out he was having a romantic relationship with his driver, who was an Irish lady whose name was Kay. And there's actually a kind of a, like say, I suppose a bit of it's a novel anyway, which is, I think it's probably basically true, but probably a bit fabricated, but describes their relationship. So anyway, that's a bit of, as I say, scurrilous Sun or Daily Mirror detail, which couldn't help but throw in.
Daily Mail comes to peace.
Daily Mail, yeah, that's it, exactly. Anyway, the reason for going to Southwick House is that they still have the kind of operations room as it was in 1944. So this is a room inside the house with the basic, map of southern England and the Channel and so on, and the routes to the Normandy beaches. The stuff on the left here are weather maps. I'll come on to those. I'll show you those in a bit more detail later on. You can see, the British, American and Canadian flags. They were the main three countries sending troops to D-Day, at the D-Day invasion. You can see that, ships and troops and stuff had come from all over Britain, right down the coast of Wales and up the east coast of Britain. And they were all rendezvousing just off the Isle of Wight. That circle there is they called it Piccadilly Circus. So that was Piccadilly Circus. And here's a blow up. And all this area, this white stuff, is where the Germans had laid mines. So one of the first, the first boats in were the minesweepers to try and get rid of those. Obviously there were mines right on the coastline as well. But it's kind of fascinating because that's exactly as it was. Okay. Right. So this is to talk about weather forecasting. Now, for right or wrong, it turns out there wasn't just one weather forecaster. There were actually three separate groups doing weather forecasting, and they were all trying to feed information into the decision process. And the two most important people were one guy called James Stagg, who represented the Met Office. And in those days, the Met Office was based up in Dunstable, north of London. And the American had a weather group, if you like, under their US Air Force branch, and they were actually based in Bushy Park, south of London. The Navy had their own weather forecast group, and they were based in that funny building. If you've been up there in London near the Admiralty Arch, there's a thing called the Citadel, which is a kind of slightly odd-looking, kind of bunkery-shaped object built, I guess, during the war. So they were there. But the two main characters in this story are James Stagg of the Met Office and this guy called Irving P. Crick of the US Air Force. These characters could not have been more different in every way you can imagine. Stagg was a Scotsman, and he was so people tell me, he was the absolute archetypal doer, Scotsman. He did not like mixing with people. He never took part in any social events at Southwick House. He would just keep himself to himself. And when he was asked for advice, he would say what he thought, and that was it. He kept all his communications to the bare minimum. Crick, on the other hand, was the kind of life and soul of the party. He was very gregarious. He loved mixing. He loved chatting to people. He was a real kind of, I'm a great guy. Listen to me. I know everything. But it turns out Crick was an utter charlatan and a rogue. He was, I would say, bordering on incompetent, if not incompetent. Whereas Stagg was a real professional, and this is an important thing that we'll come to. Okay, so we're coming towards we're coming towards the planned or the hope for D-Day of Monday, June the 5th. So basically, we'll wind to the Friday, June the 2nd, where just remember. The invasion is on, if the invasion was on June the 5th, it'll be on the very early hours of the morning of June the 5th. So, the troops will start leaving, in the afternoon of the 4th, and some of the early minesweepers and things will start even earlier than that. So, the decision to go or not to go, you can't just leave it to the last minute because stuff has already started. So already by Friday the 2nd, they were getting kind of nervous about the weather. Is the weather going to be any good for the 5th? And Ike basically says, what's the weather going to be like on the 5th? And Stagg, to his great credit, says, I don't know. I'll explain why he says that in a minute. Apparently, according to the book Ross, he said, if I answered that, sir, I would be guessing, not behaving as your meteorological advisor. I love Stagg. Stagg is a man after my own heart, and I've written a book about this. When you don't know stuff, you say you don't know. You don't make it up. Whereas Crick was the opposite. He just, I mean, if I can use the phrase, he bullshitted. And he said, it's going to be fine, no problem at all. Now, interestingly, the Admiralty, who you might think would side with the Met Office, said, I think we agree with the Americans. Now, I don't quite know what's going on here. Maybe there was some rivalry between the Admiralty and the Met Office, possibly. I do know that the weather forecasters in the Admiralty were not, did not have the same depth of training as the Met Office people have. So, for whatever reason, anyway, apparently on the 2nd, they were sort of saying, I think Crick's right. I mean, God only knows why. All right, so here's a kind of 2-minute weather. So that's a weather map, right? So you've all seen those on the TV. But that's a weather map for June the 2nd. And there are two kind of forces fighting each other here. One is high pressure. So these are the Azores Island, and this high pressure here is called the Azores High. It's all, high pressure is usually high around the Azores, and you can see this kind of high pressure ridge pushing up here towards the channel. On the other hand, if you look further north, there are all these low pressure systems, and they bring all the crap weather that you don't want. And the question is, here we are on June the 2nd, is the weather over the channel going to be dominated by the Azores High? If it sort of starts to build and gets bigger and bigger, it's going to be really nice, and there'll be, the winds will be calm and everything will be, and the sky will be clear, everything will be good. Or is it going to be dominated by these low pressure systems sort of swinging by and kind of barreling down over Britain? So that's the sort of $64 million question. And it turns out Crick and Stagg had completely different methods of trying to do this. Crick had a method which is now being completely, if I had time I'd talk more about this, but has been completely debunked, if you like, which is that you basically go back in your records of surface pressure maps and find one that looks pretty similar, hopefully, to this weather map. So let's say, you went back to 1924 or something and you find a weather map that looks a bit like this. Then you'd look at the weather map 2 days after your, what's called analogue weather map in 1924, and you'd say that's the weather that's going to happen 2 days after June the 2nd. And this is kind of based on the belief that the weather just kind of repeats itself every now and again. It just sort of, things happen after a certain time. Stagg, on the other hand, I mean, remember these are in the days before computers, but they understood the science of and the physics of the weather. They understood that these weather systems form because there are temperature. The north high latitudes are much colder than lower latitudes, and that temperature gradient creates these weather systems. And importantly, they understood that the structure of the weather systems was very three-dimensional. And in fact, these fronts, these things where weather forms along, are quite indicative of the three-dimensional structure of the atmosphere. And they were basically using ideas which had come out of a meteorological institute in Bergen in Norway, which in the early 20th century had basically, there was a guy called Wilhelm Bjerknes who wrote the definitive theory of weather systems and how weather systems develop and why they develop and so on and so forth. And one of the Met Office forecasters was a guy who was himself Norwegian, who'd been seconded by the Norwegians to work at Dunstable, and he was able to kind of train all the forecasters into these rules that Bjerknes had uncovered. So Stagg's method was much more, I would call, scientific. Crick's method was guesswork. And the Norwegian guy, Sverre Pettersen, he was utterly condemning of Crick. He thought he was the biggest rogue out. But anyway, Crick represented the US weather system, and people had to listen to him. So there we are on June the 2nd, as I say, just to go back, where it really was. I mean, the Met Office was saying they didn't know what was going to happen. Crick was saying it was going to be fine, and the Admiralty going with the Americans. So, the weight of evidence was that Ike was going to say, okay, well, we'll go on the 5th then. But then this kind of crucial thing happened, which were these weather reports. So Maureen Flavin, well, just to say who she was an Irish lady from County Kerry. So County Kerry is right in the sort of bottom south of Ireland. This place in Blacksod Bay was way up in the north. She basically answered a job advert as a post office clerk. And I don't think she even realised until she'd started that part of her duties was to take weather observations, and sometimes these would be in the middle of the night. It turned out that maybe it's just sheer fluke, but the weather observations that she made on the morning of June the 3rd was actually during her birthday. So she decided that she would take the overnight shift on the 3rd, her birthday, and that meant getting up and taking hourly records, which were, I thought originally they were sent to Dublin and then sent on to Dunstable, but they apparently were sent straight on to Dunstable. And the important point was that she measured rapidly falling pressure. The barometers were falling very rapidly during this period, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock. And the winds were picking up to force 6. By the way, just as an aside, the postmistress's son was a guy called Tom Sweeney that she ended up marrying. He was also the lighthouse keeper at Blacksod Bay, and she eventually took over as the postmistress. So she became Maureen Sweeney in later life. And here's her record of weather for the 3rd of. It's kind of a, as I say, it's hard to exaggerate how important this piece of paper was in the history of the world, because by Saturday, June the 3rd, the weather reports had been received by Dunstable, and they were now convinced that this meant that this low pressure system, not only was this low pressure system developing, there was a weather front which was moving down across Ireland and would go across Britain, end up in the Channel, and a weather front rather, and these fronts are always associated with squally showers and stronger wind gusts and stuff like that. So by the Saturday, the June the 3rd, so again, Eisenhower asks what the weather's going to be like. Stagg says, taking the Blacksod Bay reports into account, we think it will be stormy on June the 5th, but the storm will have weakened on the 6th, and you should delay D-Day by a day. Crick continues to think that's all baloney. The Azores Ridge will build, it'll be fine. Now, the interesting thing to add to all this is that both Montgomery, who was in charge of the army, and Ramsay, in charge of the navy, they both thought that these forecasts weren't to be trusted, and they would just carry on with their plan of going on the 5th. The only one of the big military chiefs who erred on the side of the forecasters was Lee Mallory, who was the Air Force chief guy, who was kind of unsure, but he realised if it was cloudy, that was not going to be good for his bombers. So he did express apparently some reservation about going on the 5th, but Montgomery and Ramsay were clear. To Ike's great credit, he decided, and the final decision was made about 4 o'clock on the 4th, to delay D-Day by a day and go on the 6th. Now, these are the weather maps which I showed, was in the room at Southwick House. This is kind of a blow-up. The one on the top left is for the 3rd of June. So that's when when Stagg was saying he didn't know basically what was going to happen, actually no, that's well, yeah, but it's just after the Black Sod Bay readings have been made. What you can sort of see is there is a low pressure system. That's the one on the second that was nearer Greenland. It's moved over towards north of the north of Scotland. But again, it's really not clear. I mean, it's certainly not clear just by looking at it whether you would think that this high pressure, the Azores high pressure, was going to build, which meant everything would be good, or the low pressure system was going to develop and everything would be bad. Well, this is the actual map for June the 5th, and I think you can see by eye, these are isobars, are lines of constant pressure. There are lots more of them, basically. So that low pressure system, consistent with what Stagg and the team at Dunstable were saying, really did develop. So his, those observations at Black Sod Bay that allowed him to make that prediction were absolutely correct. And what you can see is this front, which has kind of come down across Ireland and Britain, is now, well, this is at 7 o'clock in the morning, so let's say 5 o'clock when the invasion began, it would have been right over the French coast there. And the fronts bring, as I say, squally weather and cloud, and it's just terrible. Now the 6th of June, this is the actual map for the 6th of June. You can see that the low pressure system is, or perhaps you can see there are not so many of these isobars. So low pressure system has started to weaken, but it's actually not. The key sort of thing to look at is the gradient in these isobars, so how close they are together. When the isobars are really close, the winds are stronger for reasons which we won't go into now, complicated reasons actually. But they're not quite as strong as they are on the 5th. So the weather maps, these are the actual weather maps for those days, what actually happened. And it does pretty much bear out, it kind of justifies the decision to delay. But it's not like the 6th is going to be plain sailing. The 6th actually also, it has this pressure gradient across the channel, which did bring the winds which whipped up the sea and led to all sorts of problems. But I think the evidence is pretty unambiguous that if they had gone on the 5th, it would have failed. The winds were just so strong, and the waves were so high, and the cloud was so pervasive, it would have failed. So So Ike made a very courageous decision. All right, so let's see, we're getting a little bit close to the end. So what I'm going to do now, this is kind of why I quite like sort of thinking about these things, is to imagine, well, suppose Maureen, it's her birthday, for God's sake. Suppose she went down the pub, got completely drunk, and completely overslept. You think, oh my God, I should have taken those weather reports. Oh, what's the time? Oh no, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. I've got oh well, never mind, to hell with it. Just suppose, okay? So then we wouldn't have had those reports. Ike would have said, what's weather we like? Stagg would have continued to say, don't know. Crick would have said, oh, it'll be fine. The Admiralty was that we agree with the Americans. Montgomery and Ramsey, yeah, we need to go ahead. And just bear in mind that Ike was really worried about the fleet being discovered in Piccadilly Circus. How would he have decided? Well, I think it's pretty obvious how he would have decided. So I want to discuss the consequences of that counterfactual world in a minute. Just to say, by the way, there was a second window. One of the worst storms ever happened on the 19th of June. So that was that would have been completely, that wouldn't have worked at all. All right, so here we go. This is where a little bit of speculation. You can tell me what you think. So what if Maureen? I said couldn't be bothered to get her. Maybe she was so drunk, as I say, from the birthday celebrations. Then Stagg wouldn't have been sure about the 5th. and Ike would have gone ahead with the majority US Admiralty forecast. D-Day would have failed. Well, certainly they wouldn't have mounted another invasion in 1944. I think that would be impossible. So the invasion would probably have been delayed to 1945. Okay, what would be the consequences of that? Well, probably. I mean, Russia was already on the offensive and beating the Germans quite decisively back on the Eastern Front. So maybe they would have, instead of kind of meeting the West at Berlin, they would have carried on reaching the Rhine, or maybe even into France, and Europe would have been largely a communist-controlled country, continent rather. Now, Eisenhower would almost certainly not have been president of the US if he had, been commander of a failed invasion. So, if the Americans had been looking for a great war leader president in the 1950s, who would they have chosen? Well, the big guy on the Pacific side was was MacArthur. He was sort of in charge of many of the land forces, and he was there, signing the surrender treaty with Japan on whatever the ship was that they did that. So he would have been the hero of the Second World War, not Eisenhower. Now, the thing about Eisenhower, the more I read about Eisenhower, to be honest, the more I like him. I think he was a very sensible guy. He wasn't a gung-ho hawk. He made decisions carefully and thoughtfully. And I think as a president, you could argue he probably wasn't the greatest of American presidents, but I think he was a pretty good president, actually. And he did a lot of good things. MacArthur, on the other hand, was a different character. And I think a key point about MacArthur is that he led the US army in the Korean War in the 50s. And when the Chinese had invaded Korea and were beating the Americans back, and MacArthur was losing, he pleaded with Truman to allow him to drop atomic bombs on the Chinese. And Truman said no. Probably the reason Truman said no is that the Russians had just exploded their own atomic weapon, and he realized that there was a danger of the whole thing becoming serious. So he said no to MacArthur. And as a result, we didn't have a nuclear war in Korea. But it's clear that MacArthur was a much more hawkish type of person. And suppose he had got to power in a situation where Russia was now controlling most of Europe, then perhaps we would have had World War III in Europe. And MacArthur would have sent his atomic bombs there. And if that was the case, humanity would have been largely obliterated by a nuclear holocaust, and we would not be here today to discuss the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So, in a sense, you can thank Maureen for saving us all from nuclear annihilation. Well, okay, that's a little bit of a, perhaps it's a bit of a stretch, but that's one clause.
Would we at best be having a war with the Russians for the Isle of Wight at the moment?
Quite possibly, yes. There's an interesting, it's a slightly tangential, but there's a kind of an interesting story about the Russian nuclear bomb, because during the war, and indeed in the years after the war, there was a German refugee whose name was Klaus Fuchs, who came over to Britain. And he actually worked in the Manhattan Project in America, and he then came back to Britain after the war and worked up at Harwell. So he lived around here somewhere. And he came from he was a Jewish German who the family got persecuted by the Nazis. He hated the Nazis, and he became a communist sympathizer, as a lot of people did in those days. But anyway, he was giving some of these nuclear secrets to the Russians, and he got caught sometime in the 1950s, and was put in prison, I think Wormwood Scrubs or something, for a number of years. And you know, everyone said, "Oh, Klaus Fuchs, what an awful guy! He gave secrets to the Russians." But if, and again this is conjectural, but if he had not given secrets to the Russians, it's very unlikely the Russians would have developed their own atomic bomb at the time of the Korean War. And if that had happened, Truman, who I don't think was any great pacifist, probably would have sanctioned the use of nuclear weapons in Korea. So in a sense, we can thank Klaus Fuchs for his treachery in unwittingly, of course, preventing a nuclear war in Korea. So it's just an interesting angle on how convoluted things become. All right, so I think that's probably a good place to stop. So we can, as I say, can thank our continued existence on this planet to this little white box on the west coast of Ireland, and the fact that Maureen Flavin didn't spend the night in bed but got up to take these weather readings. Thank you.